Okay, so I guess I'll introduce myself. So I'm Sarah. I think everybody on this Zoom knows me anyway, but I'm a fifth year PhD student here at BU working with Mayank. Um, so today I'm going to talk about something that Mayank and I have been working on for the last while, basically about the Fifth Amendment and compelled decryption. And I guess I should also add that the paper that's attached to this talk just recently got accepted to Usenix, and we're working on the camera ready. So if you have comments and feedback, then I am absolutely happy to receive those comments and feedback in a somewhat timely manner so that I can incorporate them into the camera ready version of the paper. So without further ado, um, I think it's fair to say that compelled decryption is the latest version of the crypto wars in the US. So we had in the past arguments over what would be the maximum key length allowed, and there was an argument from the NSA that perhaps keys should be kept shorter so that, presumably at the time they thought the NSA and nobody else could probably brute force through crypto. And then, of course, computers changed a lot, and so it's a good thing we didn't have 48-byte keys. But we had these arguments over what would be the allowable key lengths in the US and exported from the US, and some of the export controls are still there, but not as badly as they were. And then we had sort of the chapter of key escrow, in which, again, the NSA wanted to install basically a little chip on all computers that would store keys in escrow so that if if law enforcement needed to get into the computer, they could get the key out of the key escrow and get into the computer. And that all kind of came and went and never went anywhere in the 90s, I think. And then more recently, just I guess still less than a decade ago, we had this phase of manufacturer assistance where there was this famous Apple versus FBI instance where effectively the FBI wanted Apple to change their firmware a little bit so that an encrypted phone would stop deleting itself after 10 failed attempts at login, and Apple refused to do this, and there was a whole big argument about it that never really properly got decided, because what most people think happened is that the FBI just got some kind of hacking tool to get into the phone anyway, so it didn't end up mattering. And now we're into the phase of compelled decryption. And generally, what this means is that somebody who's a suspect in a crime or is at a border crossing or something like that is asked to decrypt their phone themselves by logging into it and, bypass all of the questions of can we technologically get these, get the login or get the key, by having the owner of the device or somebody who knows the password just decrypt it themselves. And so that's where we are now, in the US at least. And this is becoming a very hotly debated question, and the courts haven't really figured out yet what the right answer on this should be based on existing law. And I don't blame them. It's really complicated, having looked into it myself now for a while. But basically, there's a split between some state Supreme Courts, some of which basically say, compelled decryption of smartphones violates the Fifth Amendment, and I'll say what the Fifth Amendment is in a second. And some of which say, no, compelled decryption doesn't raise any Fifth Amendment issues. There is technically a circuit split on this too, kind of. So the 11th Circuit says that, roughly speaking, passwords cannot be compelled. And the Third Circuit sort of says roughly that passwords can be compelled, but it's actually more complicated than that. There was some additional evidence in the Third Circuit case. So whether or not it's an actual circuit split sort of depends on how you read it. But the point is that there's not one clear answer. And most people think that the Supreme Court is probably going to take a case on this soon. So one of the goals of this paper, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is to inform that debate a little bit. And I guess I should say that Oh, somehow my thing is hidden here. One of the other things that this paper is trying to do is to move the debate, the legal debate on this, past the choice of analogy. And so there are all these different metaphors for encryption, like, is it more like a safe with a key that you can unlock, or is it more like a safe with a combination that you can unlock, or is it more like a shredder where you shred the document and then rearrange the pieces in some weird order and then try to put it back together? And we want to just reject this entire paradigm and say, look, analogies are great when you're in sort of the prototypical cases for something, but analogies start to fail when you get to edge cases and your choice of analogy changes the choice of the outcome. So one of the other things we're trying to do here is be able to ask questions about the legal status of compelled decryption directly without having to make an analogy, because depending on which analogy you use, the answer changes, and this is maybe not good. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about the legal doctrine that is used in most, if not all, of these compelled decryption cases. I'm going to tell you about our technical model for that doctrine. I'm going to walk you through some of sort of the, basic analyses on how to use this model to decide whether something is or isn't compellable. And then I'm going to talk about an additional definition that we have concocted that basically asks, how can I design a protocol to avoid this question entirely? So how can I build a crypto protocol where in the future I can't be opened up to additional compelled requests, as a separate question from whether or not a certain action is compellable by itself. So we'll start with the legal stuff. And you might have a question that is something like, rejecting this entire premise of, should we be using technological definitions to analyze legal concepts? Is this maybe just too clever and we should, spend our time doing more reasonable things? And I would like you to hold those questions until later, and I'll tell you sort of what we did, and then I'll try to justify that question of, is this too clever, or is this actually a thing that'll be helpful? And then we can talk about that again. So any other questions are totally fair game. If you're going to challenge me on, should we be doing technical analysis of legal stuff at all, then hold your thoughts until later, and I promise we'll talk about it. Okay. So now let's talk about the Fifth Amendment, since I said I would. So among other things, the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says that no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. And again, this is different than questions of the Fourth Amendment, which cryptographers tend to be a little more familiar with, which is a question about search and seizure and when the government is allowed to, search your home or search your person. This is about asking people to testify against themselves. So the process might look like this. Law enforcement might say, decrypt this phone. And our respondent here might say, no, I don't have to be a witness against myself, so I plead the Fifth. And the question is, so after that, perhaps this law enforcement person is going to order the phone to be decrypted anyway, because the Fifth Amendment protections against self-incrimination are not absolute. So specifically, the Fifth Amendment only covers actions that are three things. They have to be compelled, incriminating, and testimonial. Most of these things are pretty self-explanatory, but specifically testimonial has a specific meaning. So compelled is pretty obvious. It just means that the government made you do it and you didn't do this action of your own accord. Ends up being surprisingly relevant, but pretty straightforward to understand. It also needs to be incriminating, and specifically this means that it needs to be a, quote, a link in a chain of evidence that is needed to, that somehow incriminates you. So it doesn't need to be incriminating itself, like your location on a specific day isn't necessarily incriminating, but it might be the link in a chain of evidence that's needed to incriminate you. And then testimonial is probably the hardest one to understand. So one way to think of it is something is testimony if it uses or discloses, asterisk on uses versus discloses, the contents of your own mind, or if the court must somehow rely on your truth telling. I think it's easier to understand this by example. So let's talk about what testimony is. So first of all, what is not testimony? Providing a blood sample, providing fingerprints, or having to say something out loud or provide an example of your handwriting. All of these things are not testimonial. The first two are very easy to understand. The sort of the easy way to think about this is if a corpse could do it, it's definitely not testimony. So maybe a blood sample and fingerprints are collectible with your mind completely off. Voice and handwriting exemplars are still, I guess we've just decided that, having you say something, yeah, sure, it kind of uses the contents of your mind, but not really in any way specific to you. One that's not on this list, but should be, is also, being forced to put on a glove. This is also something that is technically not testimony. You might say, oh, well, I'm going to use my mind in a specific way when I put on, is not a terribly convincing argument. This last one is interesting. So this happened in a case called Doe versus US in 1988. The defendant was forced to sign a piece of paper that authorized a bank to disclose basically any and all accounts that he might have at this bank. This feels a little weird. It definitely feels like somehow the government shouldn't be able to make you say something. But whatever is wrong with it, it's not that it's testimonial. We didn't learn any contents of his mind by having him sign this piece of paper and send it to the bank. Okay, so now that we know what not testimony is, let's think about what testimony is. So the obvious example is, directly telling the government anything. So the Fifth Amendment tends to protect very strongly against just any compelled direct testimony, so directly answering questions. But it doesn't just have to be a verbal, a verbal description of whatever was going on, because there are other ways to testify to things. So if the government asks, to raise your hand if you were in Boston last night and to not raise your hand if you weren't in Boston last night, then the act of raising or not raising your hand communicates whether or not you were in Boston, and so testifies to whether or not you were in Boston, even though you never said anything out loud. And similarly, even acts of production, so producing documents, can also have testimonial aspects. And this is probably the hardest one to understand, so I'm going to get into it in a couple of slides. But the idea is that even just by asking you to bring specific documents, the contents themselves might not be testimonial, but your act of producing them may leak some testimony. So let me go into this in a little more detail. Like I said, direct testimony is always protected by the Fifth Amendment. So if you are asked a direct question by the government, you complete the Fifth, and this is okay. This is always protected under the Fifth Amendment. And acts of production, even though they don't necessarily testify to what you think they might be testifying to, they are testifying to something. So if you're asked to produce some train tickets and you plead the Fifth, the interesting thing here is that the contents of the train ticket are not protected by Fifth Amendment. One reason that that's true is that they were not compelled. So the contents themselves of the train ticket were not, the government didn't ask you to produce them. Didn't ask you to make the contents. So they're not compelled. And in this particular case, they're also not testimonial because presumably you did not write the train ticket. Maybe they could have been testimonial if they'd asked for a diary or something like that, but in this case, they're not testimonial either. But the production of the train ticket does leak some testimony, leak some implicit testimony. So for example, it conveys the fact that you believe the ticket exists, that you have the ticket or can get the ticket, and the fact that you believe it's the real ticket. So these are the things that are leaked by this act of production, not the contents. So I want to reframe this idea of implicit testimony as something called equivocation. So if we think about this question that the government is asking, so produce any train tickets you have for 11/20, there are a lot of different ways that this person could respond to it. And in some sense, you know, if we're in a scenario where the government can't tell which of these things is true or which of these things are not true, then we're relying on the truth telling of the respondent. And, or you could say equivalently, you know, the respondent needed to use the secret contents of their mind in order to produce the right response as opposed to the wrong response. So, you know, who knows the truth? In this particular scenario, only the respondent, only the person answering the question. So the formal version of our framework here is going to rely on this idea of equivocation. But it might be the case that the government does know something. So in my previous example, you know, they didn't know anything. We didn't know how to tell the different, like whether or not the respondent was lying about any of these. But if they had some evidence, then they might be able to tell whether certain of those equivocated statements are false. So for instance, you know, perhaps if the respondent tried to equivocate by saying they didn't take a train, they have some testimony from like the train conductor saying that, you know, she stamped the ticket that day and can testify to the fact that this respondent was on the train. So we know that that's not true. Similarly, maybe we would try to produce the wrong ticket, but the same person could say, no, that's not the right ticket. This other thing is the right ticket. You know, maybe they try to say they don't have the ticket, but we may have evidence that that's not the case. And so finally, it may be the case that there's really only one thing that the respondent can do, and it's something that the government could have done by itself. It could have used all of its evidence, and it could have gone to, you know, this person's desk drawer, which they knew about, and gone and gotten the ticket, and figured out which one was the right one by using this other piece of evidence. So this brings me to the sort of central doctrine that's used in these compelled decryption cases, which is called the foregone conclusion doctrine, which basically says that if the government already knows all of the testimonial aspects of an act of production, then they can make you do it anyway, even though, you know, normally it would still sort of be protected under the Fifth Amendment. So this comes from a case called Fisher, back in 1976. Again, like, had nothing to do with encryption. It was about whether or not somebody could be forced to bring tax papers in a court case. And basically, you know, the government's argument, I guess I should say the court's ruling rather, is that since in that particular case, the existence and location of the papers, the compelled papers, are a foregone conclusion, and the taxpayer adds little or nothing to the sum total of the government's information by conceding that he in fact has the papers. So in this case, yes, bringing the papers would have testified to the fact that, you know, he had them and he could bring them, but the government already knew all of that, and so they were allowed to ask the papers to be produced anyway. So we can apply this to the same idea in our little example. Basically, if we, you know, could have done the same thing ourselves, we have all this evidence, you know, and we could have gone through the process, we, the government, could have gone through the process of doing the same thing. And in that sense, we weren't relying on the truth-telling of the respondent, and we weren't using the contents of his mind. Maybe we were using the contents of his mind, but we could have gotten it without the contents of his mind. So now my Zoom bar is getting in the way. If the government can reliably produce the same result, then maybe the contents of the mind are not needed. And this is going to be the basis of our framework. You may be noticing that this is really similar to the concept of cryptographic simulation, and that's what we're going to run with.
So,
okay.
Sarah, can I stop?
Yeah, yeah, please.
A question. So regarding those papers, so for this argument to hold in this 76 case, it wasn't necessary that the government knew ahead of time the content of those papers. It's just the fact that there are papers and they're in some safe, right, or something.
Right. Good clarification.
Everybody wanted to know the content, but they didn't know. The only thing that was known that it's written somewhere, right? And
right.
The question is, where is it written?
Good clarification. So what we're going to do as a sneak peek is we're going to divide the world into the contents of the respondent's mind and nature, where nature is just everything else. And we're going to say, okay, the government can have access to every single thing in nature that they want. This is an unrealistic power, but you know, it's a good way to check to make sure you aren't actually using the contents of somebody's mind. And the act of production has to be replicable using only things in nature, but the government doesn't need to know the contents of the document ahead of time. So in some sense, if the government can like find the document, then the government can produce the document, because we've given them this very strong power of finding anything in nature. But yeah, that's a really good clarification.
Yeah. But I'm not asking about your modeling yet. I'm asking about actually in the case itself. It wasn't a part, but in that case, the content of the document, I guess, were not known. The question was just, you know, to the fact that it was known that those documents exist, and just you need to get them somehow.
Right. Yeah. The testimonial parts were only the act of production testimony. It wasn't the contents themselves did not need to be known ahead of time by the government. Were not known in fact ahead of time by the government.
Okay. And was it again? Of course, you know where I'm going, but actually, I'm curious about that particular case. Was there an issue of whether there's only one set of documents? Maybe there were two or three of them in different, you know, Horcruxes, different places, and, you know.
So to date, I have never seen an actual court case deal with the fact that maybe there are two different copies of the papers, one of which is fraudulent and one of which is real, that might be in two different places. So I've never seen an actual legal attempt at sussing this out. In Fisher itself, so actually in Fisher itself, the place where they talk about the foregone conclusion part was actually in a hypothetical. Normally hypotheticals are not part of the sort of ruling, I guess I'll say. But in this case,
it could be in the justification, I guess, or something, right?
Basically what happened is that if I recall, there was a sort of added complicated factor of attorney-client privilege. And the court, you know, analyzed the whole question that they were actually looking at, which was that the attorney had been asked to turn over the or maybe it was an accountant, sorry. The accountant had been asked to turn over the taxpayers' papers. And so that added this whole layer of whether or not attorney-client privilege applied. But the court also saw fit to answer, the Supreme Court also saw fit to answer, if we had, you know, directly asked a taxpayer to hand over their papers, and the same thing happened where they pled the fifth, you know, would we be able to compel that? And they decided, yes, we'd be able to compel that under this new foregone conclusion idea, because we already know all the testimonial aspects of his act of production.
And I see. So it wasn't the case that, you know, in order to compel the government or needs to convince the court that there's only a single copy, and therefore
they do need to convince the court that they have a way to authenticate them. In practice, what I have seen this used as is just, oh, well, once we have the papers, we can give them to like a bank person to authenticate them. So they do need to show that they can authenticate them. I haven't seen an actual legal case argue over, you know, what if we can authenticate each paper, but we don't know whether there are one paper, two papers, or 10 papers. I haven't seen that. I guess the closest thing I've seen is another Supreme Court case, Hubble, where the defendant was asked to bring these many different categories of papers, and so he came with, you know, like thousands of documents that fit all of these categories. And the court decided that that was not a foregone conclusion, meaning it was actually not compellable, because he had to use his mind too much in figuring out which papers adhered to the thing and which didn't. So that's, I guess, the closest thing that I've seen to it.
And that's the natural defense here, right? You know.
Right, but it's not quite the same as, you know, what if I have two papers, but I only bring you one of them, and you can authenticate the one, but you can't tell whether I have a second one. The strongest interpretation of this, which I am going to adopt in about 5 minutes, would say that revealing this would testify to whether I have one or two papers, and therefore is not a foregone conclusion. But your mileage may vary.
Okay.
Did I answer your question? I know I kind of
yeah.
said a lot of different things. Okay.
Yeah, good.
Okay,
Thanks.
cool.
Yeah.
Right, so if the government can reliably produce the same result, then contents of the mind are not needed.
So if I can just follow up, just a 5-second thing, is just to say that, like, this is a very hotly contested area of law, and like nobody agrees, and there's just everybody's theories are different. So
in fact, I could have said, so I think where Eleni's going with this.
Know that there's not like, there's no good answers. That's the
I think the thing to do is just,
Sarah said brilliant.
I can give you to create, if you have a system that, any key works, any decryption key or any password works, we just give you different contents and just give, here are 100, pick whatever you want.
Yeah, it is complicated. And one other interpretation of this thing I've been saying, depending on how highly you weight relying on the truth telling versus contents of the mind, there's sort of an important difference here where you can interpret, relying on the truth telling to mean, well, what if the defendant, the respondent, is computationally bounded and can only provide one option, but the government doesn't know what it is. So you can't simulate it. I guess I should talk about this after I describe the whole simulation idea. But a weaker thing that you might ask is just whether or not the respondent is bounded to only offer one option instead of the government being able to simulate that option or the distribution of options. And I was going to talk about that more later, but Loni is 100% right that the law itself is sort of confused about this. I actually talked about all of those cases at the beginning, in addition to the very challenging thing of figuring out what contents of the mind and relying on the truth telling are. Some courts have even just like completely messed this up and did things like compel the revealing of the password. So not just compel you to enter your password into the phone, but compel you to say your password out loud, which is direct testimony, which it seems like most legal people have already, like most legal scholars in the literature at least have said is not right, but it did happen in a court case. So it's all terribly confused right now. And hopefully we're going to alleviate at least a little bit of the confusion. That's the goal. So I guess I'll do goals first, actually. So why did we write this paper? A few different things. So one thing is that Eloni, actually, and Sinu recently, I think 2 years ago now, wrote this great paper, like a law paper, that introduced a lot of these technical questions to the legal literature. So, right, deniable encryption. What are you going to do about the foregone conclusion when deniable encryption becomes more of a big deal, or homomorphic encryption, or a lot of other things like that. The crypto community, from what I can tell, is still pretty fixated on the Fourth Amendment and other privacy issues, like what, as far as legal stuff goes, like what's a reasonable expectation of privacy if you're in the US, and whether code is speech and that kind of thing. So we wanted to bring some of the 5A issues up to the forefront of the crypto community too. We have this definition that I'm about to talk about, so we can look at them to analyze cryptographic protocols. We want to build new constructions that are resilient against the threat of future compelled actions. So regardless of what you decide is your definition for what a foregone conclusion is, you can have a notion of a protocol that is resilient to being, to having one of the parties be compelled to reveal new information. And then also, if this is actually going to go to the Supreme Court sometime in the next, let's say, year or two, then hopefully this will also be good background for expert witnesses, and hopefully we can write some kind of brief between all of the people on this Zoom call that are relative experts in this area that will help. And then also it's interesting. Okay, so what did we do? First of all, we had this definition that I'm going to tell you about in a second. We validated this definition by showing that in all of the non-encryption Supreme and Circuit Court cases, well, not all of the Circuit Court cases, all of the important Circuit Court cases as identified by legal scholars, we show that our definition holds on those. We deliberately ignored the encryption cases because they're all over the place. Like I said, there was a court that said that you could compel the password directly, which I think most legal scholars are saying is not good. So now we can avoid our analogy problem, and we can just analyze compelled decryption directly. And then we can design new protocols that are resilient against this threat. Okay, that was the end of the foregone conclusion doctrine introduction section. I have 30 minutes left, I think, so I'm going to try to go really fast. All right, so I can finally get to this technical model, which I think for the people on this Zoom call shouldn't be too bad. So here's our model, right? We have the respondent who's allowed to equivocate in certain ways. We have the government who needs to produce some kind of ability to reproduce the same result, which really means a simulator, and has to have some kind of evidence to limit the respondent's ability to equivocate. Okay, so basically this is a crypto game. The defendant is trying to show, or the respondent is trying to show that access to his mind is required. So he wants to show without access to his mind, there are thought experiment worlds in which the simulator fails, basically. And the government wants to show that no matter how the respondent equivocates, the government can reproduce the same result as the respondent. So looking at this same example, we have the same evidence here as before. Here is an alternate method that we could have used to get the train ticket. Note that we didn't need to know what was on the ticket in order to write the simulator, but the simulator will have access to nature, which is things like the desk drawer, and will be able to return the ticket. And the idea is that if for all responses that are allowed by the evidence, so for all respondent responses that fit the evidence, if those are all indistinguishable from whatever the simulator outputs, then the result is foregone. So you can imagine two different worlds, one of which the train ticket went to Boston and one of which the train ticket went to New York. But it's the same, the process of getting the ticket is the same. And so the simulator works the same way regardless. And if whatever was hidden as the process of getting this is simulatable, then it doesn't really matter what the contents were, in a sense. And then similarly, we could imagine a situation where if we hadn't had any evidence, then maybe that simulator wouldn't have worked because maybe the train tickets were somewhere else. So, okay, maybe we had no evidence and we tried to use the same simulator, and so we got the same result, but maybe in this thought experiment world that is still consistent with the evidence, the defendant did not take a train that day, and so there exists a response that is allowed by the evidence, but it is distinguishable from the simulator, so it's not foregone. So that's the I guess core idea that we're doing here. I'd also like to add that there are multiple different ways that the simulator might fail. So this is one way that the simulator might fail, where we didn't have enough evidence to pin the respondent down to the same result, or to the right result, I guess. But there might be a different reason, which is that the simulator just might not have enough information to simulate even the real response. So for example, maybe there's a confession letter buried somewhere, we don't know where. And it might just be the case that there's no way we had no evidence that would restrict where it was. And so even though perhaps the respondent's response would be the real evidence, there's still not, it's still not simulatable. So this is to say that I guess there's no distinction between the real response on the respondent and an equivocated response. It's all just, it's all equivocation. If the simulator can always simulate, then we're good. And if it can't, for some thought experiment world created by the defendant, then it is not foregone. Slightly more formally, the government is going to say what the compelled action is that they want the respondent to do. It's going to provide a simulator for that interaction, or I guess for the output of that interaction, and it's going to say what its evidence is. The respondent's power is to equivocate, and it's going to output something that is partitioned into two parts: the contents of its mind and everything else, which we call nature. And these things are probably correlated. So the idea is that we're going to give the compelled action access to both the respondent's mind and nature, and we're going to give the simulator only access to nature, and we're going to ask, okay, for all choices of R and N that are allowed by the evidence, is the output of C with access to both of these indistinguishable from the output of S with access to only nature. So here's what this looks like, and I'll scoot this up again. Right, so C, this compelled action, is a foregone conclusion with respect to the simulator S and the evidence E, if for all choices of nature and the contents of the respondent's mind that are allowed by the evidence, that's that part, if C with access to N and R is indistinguishable from S with access to just N. So this is just like a sort of, once you get past the notation, it should be relatively straightforward. Yeah.
Sarah, I have a question. So
yes.
What is the sort of type of C? Because if I think of the confession letter example, right? I don't expect the simulator to produce the text of the confession letter, or, you know,
so
or even necessarily like the fact that it is a confession as opposed to some other kind of letter. Well, maybe that's what matters. Like, what is sort of the thing you're simulating in that case, for example?
Right. So it actually, okay. So the type of C is a protocol with between. So ignore the inter part. Let's say it's just a thing that is supposed to be output by the respondent, or it could be an interaction where there's some kind of interaction between the government.
Yeah, let's just consider like something that the respondent should say.
The key thing is that the simulator has access to nature. So for the confession letter example, S doesn't need to know what the letter is, it just needs to know where it is. So if we knew where the letter was, if we knew it was, you know, buried outside BU, then the simulator just says, go to the location outside BU, dig up whatever is there, and then return that as the result. It has access to nature, so the contents of the letter are actually in nature and will therefore be the same in both the ideal world, S that is trying to read N, and the real world, which is the C, which has access to N and also R. So the idea here is that if the only hidden thing is the location of the letter, and that is the thing in R, which is the contents of the mind, then S needs to simulate that. It doesn't need to simulate the contents. And so we give the same nature string to both the real and ideal worlds. Did that make sense?
Not really. So
okay.
I mean, it did. I'm sure it did, but I didn't understand it. So let me try. So I don't even understand the conclusion in the confession letter case then. So suppose that the location of the confession letter is known only to the respondent. Then is producing that location testimony?
If the location, yes. So producing the location is testimony. If the location is known only to the respondent, then basically S doesn't know where to look. So nature, I think actually the complicated thing here is what is nature? And nature is just a big list of indices and values, which are all, let's say the values are all strings and the indices are just numbers. So the idea is, you know, nature index 1 is you know, the ground right outside BU.
Like what you would find if you went and dug at location 1.
Right. So if
I should think of it as like RAM access, like, you know.
Yes.
like an nature is almost more like an oracle, like a black box of some kind.
Nature is in fact treated as an oracle in this, where you query it on indices, which are just sort of abstractions of locations in nature, and you get back a string that is whatever is in that location. So you can drill into a safe and you can return whatever's inside the safe using this extremely powerful N thing. You can, basically, as long as you know where to look, you can get anything.
So maybe you'll get to this, but doesn't this suggest that like this kind of analysis says like you can't ask the respondent any kind of question that you couldn't have asked yourself, you couldn't have answered yourself given access to nature. And that seems to lead to the argument like, well, just go answer it yourself and don't bother asking questions.
So I would say, yes, that is a totally fair representation of what's happening. And that is the exact point of the foregone conclusion doctrine, which is that the thing you're asking is already a foregone conclusion.
But like the train tickets, it's not, right? Like suppose, somehow there is value to the evidence of the train tickets, even if I know you took the
contents. You don't need to simulate the contents though. You just need to simulate the act of production of the contents. So the sort of traditional legal way to do this is to say that there are 3 prongs of implicit testimony: existence, location, and authenticity. And the idea is that if you can, so in Fisher, when we went back to this, the idea of the taxpayer bringing his tax papers or whatever, they decided that the things that leaked, the testimony that was happening there, was the fact that the papers existed, that the papers were basically in the taxpayer's office, and that the papers could be authenticated by, say, like an IRS agent or something. And so even if you can replace the contents of the papers with anything you want, but the point is that if the government had wanted, it could have just gone to the taxpayer's office, gotten the papers for whatever date it was, and brought them in. So the testimonial aspects of the papers were already known to the government. The contents were not necessarily known, but that's okay, because the only thing we're trying to simulate was the act of production. But I claim you do actually need to show that you already know how to produce something, or else it shouldn't be a foregone conclusion.
So is the argument that it's like, again, I'm sort of puzzled by the, like, one interpretation, it seems, is that in that, given this, you should just not allow questions to the respondent.
Not allow questions of
the respondent, because if you can simulate the act of production yourself, you can go dig up the letter and get it. Like you could go to the tax office and get the records.
If the compelled, it is true. If the compelled action does not call R at all, if this C thing does not call R, then you can run S equals C, and you're already good. So if the thing you're compelling them to do already doesn't use the contents of their mind, then you should just do that.
Well, I think what Adam is saying is that anything that's allowed by the foregone conclusion under this definition, the simulator could just could output the output in the real world. So why does the government bother compelling the respondent to do anything at all? Why not just run the simulator in the real world? I think the answer is like, there's no guarantees that it's not much more burdensome to the government to run the simulator.
Right. So it seems like a matter of cost, right?
That's actually or it's even legally possible. It may not even be legally permissible for the government to do this, right? The government may not have a warrant and may not have grounds for obtaining one. But the data might be in a different country or a different state where the government doesn't have jurisdiction. It's not just a cost question, right? Like the interest, so I get your question. I sort of also vacillate between thinking the Fifth Amendment is incredibly powerful and it's incredibly pointless. But the point is, as long as the government has a way, in principle, of finding the information without you, then they can compel you to do it instead.
So I guess that's one question. So like this has a way in principle. So you're saying that could include things that are illegal, but it can't include things that take exponential time.
Can I try to, I think it's okay, actually, the definition in that respect, because I think what's going on here, it's a thought experiment, right? It says for any nature, right? So that means that, for any contents of documents, I don't know them, nobody knows them, but assume in mental experiment we knew them, then both the simulator knows them and the government knows them, in both the real and the ideal. And it would be the same, right? But no matter what the contents are, it will be okay. Of course, I want to know the contents, that's the whole point, but I want to show something else.
Right, so, but again,
I'm actually going to justify the polytime thing. I don't have a slide on it because I thought I wasn't going to get into it, but I actually want to justify that the polytime thing is justified as like an extension of the legal idea. So I mentioned this like existence, location, and authenticity thing. So I want to argue that if the government shouldn't be bounded, basically if the simulator shouldn't be bounded, then the location prong wouldn't exist, because basically the simulator could just look through every single thing in the world to find the papers. And in the same way, if that was the case, then in the 3-prong version, the government wouldn't have to show that it already knew roughly the location of where these papers are, because it could just look anywhere in the world.
So the question is, when the simulator, like, the government is bounded. Also.
Polytime versus exponential or whatever, some kind of time bound. Mm-hmm. That seems to be an argument about, actually, if it were possible for the government to do, but just extremely expensive because it would require digging, a hole at every location in Boston, then that doesn't count as like a valid simulation. Right. And so, it's important that the simulation be cheap.
Right, or at least, yes. So actually, I had for a long time argued for putting concrete bounds in this also, but the current version is still just poly in basically the number of queries. I forget I think it's the number of queries made to R, except with some minimum bound to prevent it from being like pathologically low. But I think it might make more sense with a concrete bound.
I guess what I'm saying is, like, why stop at computational cost?
Oh, I see. So wait, what else do you want to restrict it to?
If I may just say this, I think the cost way, I get your question, but I would interpret this not as a cost thing, but as a question of how much the evidence is actually, it's a question of the government's knowledge and how much the evidence is pinning down the equivocation, right? So here in a world where the government knows nothing about where the document is, the respondent can equivocate and say there's a world in which the document was at location 1, and there's a world in which the document was at location 2, and so on and so forth for every location in the world. And so really it's a test about measuring the specificity of the evidence more than it's a test about cost. I agree that cost questions are not the interesting part here. And the reason for the bound is really to pin down how illustrative is the evidence.
And I do want to really, I want to stick to my guns and say, it really does have to be able to truly simulate everything that came from the respondent's mind. And it really doesn't have to simulate anything in nature, which is everything not in the respondent's mind. Seems weird, but also I think it's the right notion, because there might be other restrictions to getting this information in the real world. Like Mayank said, there might be legal boundaries that prohibit you from doing this.
Okay.
But the point is that we just want it to be a foregone conclusion. That's the only thing we're trying to check here.
I'm sorry. I'm totally like slowing you down. So I'll let you go. Keep going. That is, and okay.
We can talk after
if we have time at the end.
So I should actually go really fast. So I'm going to skip very quickly over some of the basically just analyses of general primitives that, so like, okay, unsurprisingly, this means you probably can't simulate preimages of one-way functions unless you either already knew the preimage, which actually is the case sometimes, or you could reverse the one-way function. Not that surprising. Similarly, you probably can't decrypt unless you already knew either the key, the message, or had the ability to break the encryption scheme. Also not that surprising. We also look at some sort of future-looking stuff. We ask, okay, well, in the future, maybe courts are going to want people to commit to things or reveal zero-knowledge proofs of things. And basically, commitments are fine. At least hiding commitments are fine because
Sarah, why in terms of you can't decrypt, why can't you look at the the key is part of nature, right?
Yes, if the key is part of nature, then yes.
I can query it, right?
Yes, if the key is part of nature, you can query it. That is correct. Right. I'm thinking of a password-based key.
I think that's part of the question, right? That's right. The legal argument is whether the key is part of nature or not.
That's fair. I'm thinking of a password-based key at present with a good PBKDF. So I'm basically, so that is true. And the way we talked about this in the paper too. By the way, it's not just the key being in nature because it's like on your computer or on a hardware token or something.
Right? Yeah.
Right. I mean, it also might be the case that if there were, for instance, a like backdoor manufacturer key, then that would also work. Or if there were a, if key escrow were a thing, then the escrowed key would also work. So I guess I actually, this slide is bad. I should have written that K was, that this K in the left should be password, and this should be dec of PBKDF of K, comma C. That is actually true. Here, I'll do it right now.
Okay. But I guess if there are several keys that all decrypt the same ciphertext or different things, then it doesn't help. There can be many of them in nature. Then again, the issue comes back.
Right. It's the same thing of like if you allow it to be unbounded, then like sure. But I think the bound actually does have some meaning. The thing I actually really want to get to, okay, I'll skip over this too. So commitments, fine. Decommitments, not fine. Zero knowledge, if you don't know whether the output bit is going to be 0 or 1, then that's actually not simulatable. But if you do know that the person actually, yes, definitely has a witness, you can just run the simulator for the ZK proof. But some protocols have ZK proofs that, for instance, require setting the CRS. And if that's the case and your CRS is in nature, then that still might not work. So that's way more complicated, and I'm not going to get into it in 4 minutes, but you can ask me after. Okay, the thing I actually want to talk about is this definition of FC resilience. So up until now, we've been talking about the top thing, where we want to know whether a current compelled action is compellable based on stuff you've done in the past and how much evidence the government has and stuff. And now I want to talk about something called FC resilient, which says I am just a person and I just want to run crypto protocols all the time. And I want to know whether running those protocols will open me up to future compelled requests. So the way we do this, we say a protocol is FC resilient. Basically, if the set of things that are foregone conclusions after running the protocol is the same as the set of things that were foregone conclusions before running the protocol. So basically you show everything that the protocol added to either nature or your mind or whatever, and you show that it was already, actually just nature, I guess, and you show that it was already compellable before running the protocol. By identifying the changes the protocol makes to nature and showing that they were already foregone. This obviously is not going to work if you're in the middle of typing your password per se, because there is a moment when you're, after you've entered your password, but before you've done anything with it, where the government can swoop in and say, all right, I'm going to compel you to reveal everything that's on your computer right now. And we basically treat these times when you're actively using your mind as sort of the same modeling as like a hardware token, where we're basically saying, okay, as long as you don't corrupt me in the middle of doing this this process, then I'll be okay.
Sarah?
So yeah.
Since we're like pretty out of time.
Yeah, I was going to go until
it looks like
50.
on the calendar, it looks like there's nobody scheduled for next week.
There is nobody scheduled for next week.
How do you feel about?
But I'm still trying to get someone.
Oh, I see. Okay, I was gonna suggest you could just continue it.
I guess I could. I don't know. I'm still trying to get somebody for next week, and I don't want to like write that off. But I guess if I don't get anyone, then I can try.
No, I think we want to hear the rest of it and discuss. So,
yeah,
that would be nice to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if people want to hear the second half of this next week, then I can just stop looking for somebody to fill next week's slot, and I guess I can spend the hour talking about FC resilience.
Yeah.
Is that a thing you all are interested in? Because I don't want to take up, you know, two 14ths of the.
Yeah,
I think
I vote in favor.
Okay, everyone's plus one-ing. All right, sounds good. In that case, I will just stop here. Oops. And I guess I will talk about FC resilience next week. That's fair.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about computational. Will you have a chance to talk about the computational stuff about the simulator? I think there are lots of details here, and the devil is in the details, right?
The devil is definitely in the details.
Right. I think the nice thing is you can probably map all the different arguments before to different portions of this definition, right? What the complexity of the environment, complexity of the simulator, and it can be different types of complexities, right? Computational complexity, access to other information, etc. So then I don't know, and also can the simulator kind of rewind the government, or
right? Well,
or just take it like that. All these technicalities, right?
Right. As far as this question went, here the simulator is rewinding. Oh, you're right, actually. Yeah, it's rewinding as normal, but like that's okay. I can make a more detailed thing on this.
And also, there's something strange here, right? So somehow it is the government. Okay, so there are two parts of this government, right? Usually, is the analyzer. You want to think of you want to simulate an adversary, right? So you want to simulate kind of an arbitrary government. But then it is the government who has to come up with a simulator to begin with. So it's kind of a strange thing.
So, right. So not shown here is that we are assuming that the government is always honest about what it does say. We're not assuming it tells everything it knows, but we are assuming that the things that it does say are legitimate and honest. Which makes this simulator also kind of weird, but I mean, the weirdest thing is that you can compel zero knowledge proofs at all, to me. And the fact that the simulator is a little bit weird is sort of just icing on the cake. But I can also talk more about, I didn't get into the, too many details on this either, and I'm happy to go further into that as well. We had all these like extra little.
The simulator is simulating nature, right, or something. It's not really.
No, the simulator is not simulating nature. The simulator is given access to nature, and nature is created by the respondent.
Yeah,
it is simulating which queries it wants to make into nature.
Yeah, so maybe it's simulating one nature given another nature. Because again, if the government is known, if the code of the government is known, that kind of like not clear but simulating it means, right?
Well, the government is, in some sense, the government is the simulator. By the way, people can leave. This is definitely the end of the talk. Thanks, y'all. I guess I'll keep going next week.
Stop the recording.
I should probably stop the recording. Stop recording.